Alrighty guys, so welcome to our class on European modernism. So here we're going to be talking about primarily in the 1920s and 30s what's been going on in Europe as, Frank Lloyd Wright has been rising in America. So today we're going to be talking about the rise of the modernist architects in the 1920s and 30s. Those architects that Americans had embraced in the 1930s, but, frustrated Frank Lloyd Wright when, the Museum of Modern Art in New York mounted that exhibition, sidelining the arts and crafts architects in favor of European modernists. So, during the 1920s and 30s in Europe, modernism really started in the most unassuming places, really as a political reaction to different things going on at the time. So it started really at the earliest in backwater Russia during the Russian Communist Revolution as a reaction to, the traditional Tsarist regimes ruling, with an iron fist and building in these very strict historical revivals. So, in reaction, Russian modernists wanted to start over with their buildings. They wanted to use architecture to encourage people to come together in communities and to discourage class disparity. And then modernism also cropped up in post-World War I Germany as the Nazi regime was slowly gaining power, and the country, split into right-wing nationalists favoring stripped-down historical revivals and the left-wing socialists favoring a sort of start-from-scratch minimalist approach in art and architecture. And then finally, the modernist movement also in these years rose up in France, spearheaded by Le Corbusier as a sort of more philosophical reaction to the terrible living conditions in crowded historical cities in France. So, French modernists were obsessed with building machines for living in, which were supposed to prioritize light, health, and the efficiency of living for its occupants. But, we'll talk about Le Corbusier mostly in the next lecture, as I have, an entire biography devoted to him in the next lecture. But today, we're going to be looking mostly how these first two liberalist modernist movements were born as a reaction, a negative reaction to the authoritarian regimes and their architecture. So, the modernists in Russia during the 1920s and 30s and the modernists in Germany during the 1920s and 30s. So this is all, building up to the breakout of World War II. This is where architecture was going in Europe. And this is what began to influence America right at the downfall of Frank Lloyd Wright's career, just so you can get a little bit of sense of a time scale here with our past lectures and our current lectures. So let's begin with talking about the situation going on in Russia. So let me begin by saying many architects at the turn of the century had this idea that revolution can be avoided with the right architecture. So, for example, if social housing were treated with the same care as the machine-made briar pipe, much of the social pressures which cause revolutions stemming from unhealthy living conditions would be eliminated. But the social revolution that a lot of these turn-of-the-century architects feared happened in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia led by Vladimir Lenin. Many architects said, of course this happened in Russia, the place with no modern architecture, but, very few people honestly in foresight expected Russia's transformation into the very center of the movement for socialism. And even fewer expected the artistic and architectural movements that accompanied this revolution. Russia, more or less, led the charge of modernism around the world. So, for a bit of context, Russian architecture before the Bolshevik Revolution really lacked any sense of modernization at all. It ranged from, historicist religious works and imitations of European academic styles, but Russia lagged behind Europe architecturally. They had not even become involved in the slightest in the arts and crafts movement nor the Art Nouveau movement. And actually, the few public works designed immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution insisted still on an academic tradition. So, after removing dozens of Tsarist sculpture, the new Soviet government actually installed new statues of Bolshevik heroes designed in a similar academic style. And they began to actually build new government buildings just like the old Tsarist palaces in this sort of neoclassical or Beaux-Art styles. So, the first stirrings of what we call Russian constructivist architecture, or basically Russian modernism, was done by Vladimir Tatlin, and he objected to the resurrecting of historicist fashion in Russia because it showed that the cultural consciousness wanted to revere revolutionary heroes as Tsarist kings rather than as heroes of the people, equal to the people. Similarly, Russia's beaux arts in neoclassical buildings were an expression of flaunted wealth, he said, something the new revolutionaries should want to put behind them. So, Tatlin attempted to challenge the revolution's initial conservative architectural approach in this proposal for a new type of building, a new type of monument, which he called the Monument to the Third International, which he exhibited in a festival in Moscow in 1920. He wanted to have it built in St. Petersburg as the new headquarters and monument of the Communist International Party. This, model portrayed an open-webbed iron structure, kind of similar to the Eiffel Tower, that coiled up in two spirals around a tilted mast. It was envisioned as this towering symbol of modernity, this towering symbol of the new communist regime. At the base of the structure would be a cube which was designed as a venue for lectures and also for conferences and legislative meetings, and this would complete a rotation in the span of 1 year. Above the cube would be a smaller pyramid housing executive activities and completing a rotation once a month, and then further up would be a cylinder which was to house an information center, issuing news bulletins and manifestos via telegraph, radio, and loudspeaker, and this would complete a rotation once a day. Although, this piece of building was a bit extreme for its time, it struck the leaders of the revolution as really the first monument without a beard, as they said. So, the first non-antiquated monument in Russia. And although Lenin remained really unsympathetic to experimental architectural movements, it inspired an architectural aesthetic of industrial materials assembled in interpenetrating forms. And this would be the hallmark of Russian constructivist buildings, as we shall see going forward. Another early constructivist architectural thinker was Lidzitsky, and in 1923 he proposed his cloud hangar, this kind of flattened version of a skyscraper, which he recommended placing as a series around the external ring of Moscow. So he proposed, very obviously you can see here, rather than a simple tower, a cantilevered loft for 2 levels of offices over 4-story shafts. And this is because he claimed this represented a very anti-capitalist solution driven by a desire to keep the land open to the public, to give the roads and sidewalks, to give the ground back to the public, and not try to claim any ground land, but instead make office spaces as unobtrusive as possible. And so, although these are just proposals, these were never built, I just wanted to show them to you so you can understand the line of thought of these early Bolshevik revolutionists. Things like erecting these kind of very anonymous monuments, shedding historical styles, and reinventing what a building can and should be is at the front of the minds of these Russian constructivists. But really, the first Russian modernist to build anything in this new constructivist architecture was Konstantin Melnikov, who designed this Soviet Union pavilion to be exhibited at an Art Deco exhibition in Paris in 1925. And here, you can see very plainly the building was completely unadorned except for a suspended hammer and sickle emblem. The walls ran entirely flush with the steel sash windows and offered, a much more industrial embrace than was really popular at the time in France. But as we'll see next lecture, Le Corbusier was already experimenting with such aesthetics. And so during the late 1920s, Melnikov would go on to build 6 of the 30 Soviet Union workers' clubhouses in Moscow, which became sort of emblematic of the state's commitment to the development of a proletarian culture that would replace the role of churches. So, The Rusakov clubhouse you see here is built on a sort of fan-shaped plan with these three cantilevered concrete seating areas rising above the base, jutting out of the building. And each of these sort of volumes can be used as a separate auditorium or combined, and resulting in a massive auditorium seating 1,000 people. And at the rear of the building are more conventional offices. The only visible materials though used in its construction are concrete, brick, and glass, and these would become staples of Russian constructivist architecture. Melnikov even built his own house in 1927. This was his personal manifesto against bureaucratic architecture once and for all. He composed the house as these two interlocking cylinders, and inside, non-bearing wooden partitions could easily, arrange for collective or individual needs. And so Melnikov clustered services for cooking and bathing in radiating rooms on the ground floor, putting the sleeping area on the middle floor, and the top story was this double height space for his studio and a rooftop terrace. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These are all really early experiments in the Russian constructivist movement in early Soviet Russia. But after the death of Lenin in 1924, remember, he was kind of apt to adopt these very new avant-garde architectural movements. The rest of Russia begins to latch on to this idea of anti-bureaucratic architecture. So after the authorities in the Soviet Union began to develop a taste for Russian constructivism, the most really functional and really most widespread architectural type within Soviet Russia is this type of apartment building. It's called the social condenser, and it was very popular as an apartment building in the earlier Soviet Union. So this is the Narkomfin housing block, the first of its prototype, and this one was specifically designed for the employees of the Ministry of Finance, so for these government officials to live in. And they're essentially intended as social condensers that would, promote collective living, that would turn disparate, separate living individuals into focused and useful socialist party members, as they would say. The goal was to make social differences disappear. And you'll probably recognize this kind of style of apartment block all around the Western world. It was the ultimate model for Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation in Marseille, France in the 40s and 50s, which we're going to look at in the next lecture. And it also provided much of the inspiration for the post-World War II reconstruction apartment buildings built in Britain and the US from the 50s to the 70s. So how did this social condenser apartment building actually work? So, you'll see the main residential block in front is linked by a first floor bridge to a communal block. And this communal block is where all the residents have to do their cooking and laundry. There's communal restaurants here, and there's a daycare here. And so the units in the residential block themselves are designed without kitchens, without laundry. Basically, if you want to do anything but sleep or read, eventually you have to get out of your room and interact with the community. What's more, according to the Soviet government's kommunikala policy, any apartment of more than one room had to be shared by more than one family, so you could expect several unrelated people or families living in isolated living rooms and sharing a shower and toilet. On the bright side, though, this building took in more light than virtually any building previously built in history. And outside of the very over-collectivist living situation, it was actually quite nice. On the roof, you had a communal garden and a massive communal sunroom. And then underneath, slender columns support the residential block and open up the ground floor as a pass-through garden for pedestrians. This is, the same idea we saw in the Cloudhanger building, making buildings with no footprint. So, I think the more social among you will get excited to live somewhere like this and wish it could be done the right way. Obviously, looking at the picture on the right, it hasn't been done the right way. But the more individualist among you will be disgusted by this. Personally, I would be very uncomfortable living here. I like my personal space and I like to do my chores and cooking in private. I would probably attempt to sort of bend the rules to my own comfort, setting up a kitchen with a hot plate in my room and, even washing my own clothes in the sink. I don't want to be seen every time I have to do my chores. But, this is exactly what started to happen here in many buildings like this. These Soviet sponsored apartment buildings were just too communal, too noisy. If you wanted to do anything other than sleep, you had to get out of your room. And so as these buildings fell out of favor with the rise of Stalin, fewer and fewer people lived here, and the ones who stayed started to re-individualize the spaces meant for multiple families. They kind of strung together multiple rooms, built walls between the communal spaces, and they even, if you can tell, turned the ground floor into new apartments. And so in the end, these buildings fell into the hands of private landlords and really lost government upkeep. And a main reason why there's such a sorry sight today is because, yes, individualism won out, but also simply they have no roofs or cornices, so rainwater washes down the sides freely and discolors the buildings. A lot of modernist buildings have this problem that really detract from what's supposed to be a rational, clean, precise design. And in any case, the Soviet Union in the 1930s turned back to a sort of modernized neoclassical aesthetic, and these kinds of apartments fell out of favor. As Joseph Stalin consolidated control over the Soviet government in the late 1920s, he gave new public buildings a decidedly anti-modernist style, decorating them with the classical pilasters reminiscent of the neoclassical Tsarist palaces. This is called Stalinist classicism, and by the 1950s, Soviet Russia's taste had turned away from Russian constructivism entirely. So, Soviet architecture usually refers to one of two architectural styles, emblematic of the Soviet Union, which we both recognize as Soviet today. The first is constructivist architecture, really prominent in the 1920s and early 1930s, and then the second is what we call Stalinist architecture, really prominent in the later 1930s through to the 1950s. So let's shift gears and look at Germany now. So up until the end of World War I, the more experimental architects in Germany were still mostly pursuing the arts and crafts aesthetic. But after losing World War I, a socialist revolution happened in Germany too. This is called the Spartacus movement, and it happened in 1918. But 2 months later, the state crushed the revolt, and this intense moment of political uncertainty led to the division of the country into right-wing nationalists and left-wing socialists, and this inspired an explosion of artistic exploration inspired by Russian constructivism. This included the founding of the Bauhaus, which I'm sure many of you have heard of if you've taken any other modern art history classes, but this is a state design school that would become the most influential modern design school in Germany. So in 1919, Walter Gropius, which you can see up here, is an architect emerging in this new revolutionary social environment, and he founded the Bauhaus School in Weimar. It replaced an arts and crafts academy and devoted itself toward making a new art for a new socialist Germany, which many socialist art circles saw on the horizon. Looking at this in hindsight, we know this is false. The Nazi regime took over, but you have to look at this through contemporary eyes. So, fresh from the horrors of World War I, they wanted to turn over a new leaf to start with the basics. The right-wing Nazi party was growing in Germany and promoted historical revivals, the neoclassical and the Gothic, and so these left-wing artists and architects in Germany at the time devalued historicist fonts, art, and architecture. As a reaction against this, they felt they had to start from scratch with art. So Walter Gropius and his students produced a new German style of architecture and art, really heavily inspired by Russian constructivism, which they called neoplasticism, and it relied entirely of primary colors, flat planes, and right-angled geometry. So neoplasticism was off the bat just taught at the school for use on paintings and textiles, but it was pursued in 3 dimensions for the first time in 1924 by Gerrit Reveld, one of the students from the Bauhaus in the Schroeder House, and after this point, the Bauhaus began to teach architecture. Rietveld colored each plane and element in the house independently, just like neoplastic paintings. His client Truus Schroeder actually requested a house without walls, so Rietveld organized the upper story as this open space that could be subdivided into 3 rooms with these primary colored sliding wooden planes. The first new Bauhaus exhibition in 1923 was held to showcase its new neoplastic aesthetic, and so it produced, among many things, this prototype house for a new Germany. The structure's flat roofs, steel sash windows, and very planar surfaces were inspired by Russian constructivism and retained nothing of the handcrafted arts and crafts aesthetic, to the surprise of the visitors. And Bauhaus posters for this exhibition emulated constructivism with these dynamic abstract compositions made from squared off letters in numbers, just like Russian constructivist posters. But the exhibition so irritated the powerful right-wing authorities in Germany, who associated the style with the Bolshevist Revolution of Russia, that Walter Gropius and his school were forced by law to leave Weimar. So the transfer of the Bauhaus to Dessau in 1925 allowed Walter Gropius to design a new Bauhaus building as his manifesto. It had 3 wings, one dedicated to artist workshops, another whole wing for Germany's new architecture, and a third for student housing in a 5-story tower and bridges which connected these 3 wings. After Walter Gropius, the school went through several political disagreements and, as a result, cycled through a series of directors, but its philosophy essentially remained the same throughout the 1920s and 30s, devaluing historicist fonts, art, and architecture promoted by the right-wing Nazi Party, and as a reaction against this, they felt they had to start from scratch with art. Mies van der Rohe took over as director in 1930, and he taught a more uncompromising minimalist approach to architecture to the students, but still in line with neoplastic sympathies. So this can be seen in his Tugendhat house. The use of floor-to-ceiling panes of glass wrapping around the salon created this sense of integration with the landscape when viewed from the inside, right? Like Frank Lloyd Wright houses, it drew you outside to nature, and it provided what was thought at the time to be a very healthy lifestyle with as much light as possible. We're going to talk about Mies van der Rohe later, for he would become a very influential European architect, but he got his start here. He essentially taught his students to develop neoplastic versions of garden cities, and he had great plans for the cities of new socialist Germany. Unfortunately, as we know, the Nazi Party gained leverage and power, and any art associated with the Bauhaus and left-wing modernism was sadly suppressed, and the Bauhaus was forcibly shut down in 1933 due to pressure from the Nazis. Germany became a land of historical revivals once again. So, what actually ruined historical revivals for post-World War II Europe? And the answer is the totalitarian regimes in Europe. Italy in 1922 gave way to an authoritarian government run by the Fascist Party and its leader Benito Mussolini, and a decade later, Germany followed suit with the rise of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. Spain also fell to military dictatorship in 1936, as had Portugal in 1932. So the totalitarian governments protected a benevolent public image, and amid the crisis of capitalism in 1929 with Russia, they boasted full employment and optimistic national unity. The architects of fascist Germany and Italy created grand assembly spaces and monumental public buildings as propaganda. They returned to building on a colossal scale, using masses of historically inspired masonry to express durability of their military regimes. Hitler's cultural policies condemned modernism in the arts as degenerate and poorly suited to national values. The modernist flat roof became a frequent subject of ridicule and source of racist slurs such as Oriental and nomadic. Hitler pursued his ideal architecture in Munich, where his favorite architect Paul Trost designed the Führerbau, a palace of dictators' offices and a matching building across from it. Trost inserted between the two palaces open-air memorials to Nazi martyrs, each framed with 24 square Doric columns. In 1935, Hitler chose Albert Speer as the new state architect. The young architect began in Nuremberg. He led out the Grossstrasse, a 40-meter wide parade access paved with huge granite slabs for the marching formations of thousands of troops. At the cross axis, he placed on one side the German stadium modeled on the ancient stadium in Athens, and opposite it the Zeppelin field with its marble-clad tribune inspired by the altar of Pergamon. During Hitler's annual harangues, the soldiers stood attention in perfect rows. Further down the parade axis, the Congress Hall, designed by Ludwig Ruff and his son Franz, an immense simulation of the Colosseum, was planned to hold 100,000 but remained unfinished at the outbreak of World War II. The granite panels of its facade are flattened, stylized versions of the classical model, similar to the late fascist style of Italy. Hitler's headquarters, the new Chancellery, stood out as one of the buildings realized for the New Berlin Plan. It had an inordinately long, narrow plan like the great temple compounds in ancient Thebes, while the exterior blended with the three-story surroundings of the surrounding buildings. The scale of the interior was huge. The route to Hitler's office extended more than 300 meters, passing through 5 control spaces. The austere Doric columns and pilasters rose to double height like Renaissance palaces. The great marble gallery, completely covered in marble, gave evidence of the building's great expense. Fascism revitalized traditional Italian architecture as well as a reflection of Mussolini's exploits. Around 1920, Milan hosted a conservative movement in the arts called the Novecento, or 20th century style. So Giovanni Muzio was really the most influential of the Novecento architects, and he built this apartment complex, Ca' Brutta, his breakout work, this 2-block apartment complex in Milan. And Muzio basically flattened classicism, flattened Greek and Roman and Renaissance classicism. So, here on this apartment complex, you can see he's flattening all the niches, all the columns, the pediments, the balustrades. He kind of pancaked and simplified traditional ancient Roman and Renaissance architecture, and this became the foundation of the official Italian fascist style, really favored especially by Mussolini himself. The Novecento style influenced one of the first major fascist state projects begun in 1928 on the northern outskirts of Rome, the Foro Mussolini by Enrico del Debbio. So, emulating an ancient imperial form, this architect arranged a group of essentially sports halls in a stadium around an obelisk and mosaic paved plaza, just like an ancient Roman circus. And then kind of ancient looking Roman mosaics on the inside depicted modern things like military emblems and airplanes and scenes of war. And around the running track, you had these muscle bound male nudes lining the parapets of the grandstands. Soon, the prominent architect Marcello Piacentini attracted the attention of Mussolini, and in 1928 his scheme of Piazza della Vittoria in Brescia served as the models of fascist planning and space making. So a large section of the historic city underwent essentially disemboweling to be replaced by this rigid space lined with colossal public buildings and Italy's first skyscraper. Piacentini carefully repeated historic types such as loggias and champanelles, but used familiar materials such as travertine and banded masonry. At the same time, he inflated the scale and stripped down the facades to the essentials in the classic Novecento style. The Fascist Party's headquarters in Como, built between 1932 and 1936, was essentially a stylization of the Renaissance palazzo. So, you can see its use of reinforced concrete and panes of glass brick in the form of a Renaissance palace or a Roman temple appealed to antiquity but showed the regime as modern at its core. But this, really was as modern as fascist Italy was willing to go.